So anyway, Pat is going to do a presentation on remote viewing, and let's have a round of applause for him, Mr. Pat Kell.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, guys, welcome everyone to Samui Real, session 161. Great. Okay, it's a nice little crowd. I love it when it's small. Okay, so as you all know, today is a socializing open night. So it's not strict, it's very casual to talk. And the subject tonight is remote viewing. Okay, so in 1972, two young scientists in their late 30s, a guy called Harold Putoff and Russell Targ, together with funding from the Stanford Research Institute and also the Defense Intelligence Agency, started a program to do research on ESP to find out how, well, the psychic abilities of humans. So they started with this research at SRI, which is Stanford Research Institute in California, United States. And they recruited some psychics. So one of the great psychics they recruited is a guy called Ingo Swann. So today I'm going to give you a basic overview or outline of what remote viewing is. Who's heard of remote viewing? Right? Who can explain what remote viewing is? Yeah, great, all of you. Make me feel intimidated, thank you very much. Okay, so remote viewing is the human ability to psychically see a targeted object, one, a person, two, a place, or an event, okay, while being completely isolated by distance, space, and time from the targeted object, person, place, or event. So what it means is I could be here in a room and I can push my consciousness out to another location somewhere out of this room and I can see what's happening. And the way they do it is very interesting. It might come up in the Q&A, but the way they do it is they tap into the ether. And right now there's a protocol called the Stargate protocol that was developed in the early 70s, mainly by Ingo Swann and the two scientists that I said before. That being again, Harold Putoff, otherwise known as Hal Putoff, and Russell Targ. So let me just give you an overview and show you on my beautiful drawing what we're going to talk about today. Handwritten, of course, as always, because I am old school. Right, so I'm going to open this sucker up right here. Boom. Okay, so if you remember, the last talk I did 2 weeks ago was on the moon. And 2 weeks before that, I did another talk on the moon, but in more detail because the group was small like this. So hopefully tonight there'll be a lot of Q&A and you can answer lots of questions about remote viewing, okay? So why did remote viewing come about? So during the Cold War, there was a document in the early 70s, about 1972, supposedly there was a CIA document that was floating around which suggested to them that the Soviet Union was actually using psychics to gather intelligence and information about the US. So whether that document or the content of that document was real or not, we're not sure. But it was real enough that it instigated the CIA to actually take action and say, well, if they're doing it, we need to do it. This may be the same thing for the UFO phenomena, the same thing. So I will talk about that in a minute. 1972, Stanford Research Institute, which is in Melrose Park in California. We have two people, it's known as SRI, two people, Hal Putoff, Russell Targ, begin this investigation into ESP, basically people's ability to read other people's mind, telepathy, communicate with other people using mind talk, and three, telekinesis, which is tele, meaning distance, kinesis, which means to move. So the ability of a human to move objects using just the mind. So they were doing these three experiments. But then what happened is along the way, the remote viewing part of it, which had just been called remote viewing, the remote viewing part of it became more urgent and more interesting for the likes of the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. They were more interested in gathering intelligence about the Soviet Union rather than pushing envelopes and pens from here to there. So that became the focus of this project. So we see what happened. From 1972, this stuff happened. Now, the main remote viewers that you will probably read about, are four people at the beginning. We have a guy called Ingo Swann. Heard of him? Yeah, we know Ingo Swann. Okay, the second guy is Pat Price. Not Pat Kell, Pat Price. I'm not on this list, unfortunately. The third guy is a guy called Joe McMonigal. And then the fourth guy I've written down at the bottom is a guy called Uri Geller. So the older ones, maybe you know of Uri Geller, bending this spoon, using my mind, right? Using his mind or just rubbing it, he would bend spoons. He was world famous on television programs all around the world. He was even more well known than these guys. So now let's understand the generation of these remote viewers. The first one, Ingo Swann, started earlier. Before he joined and volunteered for the Stanford Research Institute ESP experiments, he was volunteering his abilities for a place called the American Society of Psychical Research. And he was doing things that were a little bit boring for him. Things like they were saying, guess what's in this envelope? And here was an envelope. This happened to be there, probably my telephone bill. But he was to guess what was inside the envelope. Other things were like, guess what's inside the box. After a few years of doing this, it was hit and miss. He got a little bit bored. So he suggested to them, can we do something different? Like something more exciting. And he threatened to quit. And because he threatened to quit, the two scientists and the SRI, they said, okay, what do you want to do? He said, why don't one of you guys go out into the city? Why don't you go out into the city, and then I will guess your surroundings, and I will take a stab in the dark at where you actually are. And this was the first time that they actually left the room, went out into the city, and he would guess or remote view where they were. That was the beginning of it. So the actual term remote viewing came about one day when he was lying in the pool with his head against the edge of the pool, and he had this idea. So we're just looking at things at a distance, and remote viewing popped into his head, and then they started using remote viewing as a term. So it became known as remote viewing as early as the 1970s. Interesting stuff. So in 1977, let's fast forward 5 years. What happens over 5 years? A lot of different remote viewing sessions were carried out by these three guys. Ingo Swann was a pioneer. He is credited to be the father of remote viewing because he helped create protocols like the SCAN8 protocol, which is the one, SCAN8, which is where you scan coordinates. So he came up with the idea, like, why don't we use something like, for example, 60 degrees, 29 minutes, northern latitude, and then 146 degrees, 39 minutes, west. And then by using these coordinates, remote viewers would have two sets of numbers which they would psychically connect to, knowing that it was somewhere on planet Earth, at the beginning, on planet Earth, and they would tap into the ether. So it's very interesting because it sort of links with the idea of the Akashic records, the idea that humanity, we as a species, every time we have a thought, every time we have a word or take an action, that information is put out into the ether, and that information stays there forever. Okay, so imagine people who live at a very remote coordinate, right? Those people have a memory of that place, so that memory, those people are associated with a specific place on the planet, and that is in the ether. So giving coordinates help the remote viewers actually hone in, grab onto something. It's like I have a grappling iron. I want to climb a cliff. I just throw it and it grabs something. That is what they use as a place from which they go into their remote viewing session. And they call it the SCAN8 protocol. Jointly developed mainly by Ingo Swann and SRI. Now what happened is Ingo Swann did a few sessions. Ingo Swann and then Pat Price, who was a retired police constable, well actually he was a commissioner. This guy seems to be very talented. Unfortunately, his life ended in tragedy in 1975. But there were times where they gave two remote viewers at the same time what they call a blind target. So how they did a session is we'd have a table, let's say Dennis is the interviewer, he would have an envelope with maybe a map and maybe numbers written inside the envelope. We put it on the table, then he would just tell me coordinates. 2 sets of numbers, that's all I hear. Go to those coordinates. I would go into my eyes don't do that, but for effect, go to those coordinates, describe what you see. So different remote viewers would have stronger characteristics of their abilities, such as some people would feel more, some people would see clearly, some people would hear sounds, and they all had different, but what they drew was often similar. So there was an instance where Ingo Swann and Pat Price were given coordinates by a CIA analyst. He gave them coordinates and said, go to these coordinates. So both of them do it, and they're not in the same room. These guys are completely separate. They're not allowed to talk to each other. They're separated, and they go into their remote viewing session. What happened is they both ended up drawing the same thing. And when they brought it back, and they showed the analyst, he goes, oh shit, that's totally off. You guys are completely wrong, both of you. And they go, oh, really? And he goes, yeah, I gave you the coordinates to my vacation home in Maryland, a place called Sugar Grove in West Virginia. I gave you the coordinates, and this is my holiday house that you should have remote viewed. And they were going, well, that's strange. And they all thought, it's a little strange. You guys didn't draw a picture of my house, but you've drawn some kind of what looks like a military installation. Had a big, massive dish in the middle, with the antenna in the middle. They described the guardhouse. They described office buildings on a large plot of land. And they described that Pat Price in particular went into a lot of detail. He actually was able to go within the building, and this is all classified. He went within the building, he went into a filing cabinet, and he saw a cabinet called Project Pool. And inside the folders, he was actually able to go and look at each folder. It had 8 ball, 9 ball, 14 ball, record. All of these numbers, all of these names that he was actually able to produce as intelligence and information and write it down and record it. And then they thought, well, that's a bit weird because this is nothing like my vacation home. So they said, well, why don't we send someone out there to check? And so they send somebody out to Sugar Grove in West Virginia, and what do they find? A couple of 100 meters away from this analyst's holiday house, across the ridge, was an installation which turned out to be an NSA listening station. And it was considered one of the most secretive, top secret installations in the country. And somehow both of them got that instead of the house, which was only a few 100 meters away. And the reason why is because most of the targets that they'd been given until then had been things like installations. For example, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Joe McMonagle, all of them were often given information. They were given coordinates that was ended up being somewhere in Russia, like the Kola Peninsula, where they would have these nuclear submarines, these top secret weapons, and they would go in there and they were expecting another session like that. But in the end, it was just the house that they were given. So what they actually saw a couple 100 meters away, which the CIA analysts did not even know existed, was this top secret NSA listening station. And so what happened is all the intelligence agencies came to Stanford Research Institute, and they got a good grilling. And they got into trouble. They got into trouble because they had come across this top secret. They should not have known about it. Even apparently the names of the projects that were on the folders that Pat Price saw were top secret. Just the names of these projects were top secret. So that's when the CIA goes, wow, but wait a minute. Maybe we can use this. And so they drafted Pat Price from SRI, and they took him to work for the CIA. He only worked for the CIA for 4 months. Okay? So there are a couple of things that he did, a lot of like remote sessions that were very accurate. And what happened is one day when he was in Vegas, 4 months after starting his new job with the CIA in 1975, he was at a hotel in Las Vegas, and he remembers, he explained, he walked past, was bumped by somebody, felt a sharp pain in his leg, went to his room, had stomach cramps the next day, and he died. Okay, he died the next day. And unfortunately, the thing is, the way he died, you'd think he'd get this big burial and his wife would know and the family would be there. Apparently, nobody knew. They scrubbed the hotel room straight away. His body was gone, and he was cremated before they even told his wife that he had died. Cause of death, heart attack, or climate change. I'm not quite sure. One of the
COVID.
two. COVID, yeah. And so this is quite amazing. And why did they do it? He was apparently buried in an unmarked grave, and they think that it's like, they call it marker 700, somewhere in North Hollywood. But it was a shame, and the reason is because they believe, well, many years later, decades later, there was a Soviet spy who defected from the Soviet Union to the US. Now he claims that decades before, one of his targets in the US was an American psychic who was in Las Vegas. So we don't know if that's true, but apparently this is what happened to Pat Price. An amazing guy. So the NSA listening station was one of them. Ingo Swann, interesting, because he was getting a bit bored with remote viewing locations on the Earth. And then one day, he said, can we go somewhere else? The SRI guys came to him and said, well, how about Jupiter? And he goes, well, Jupiter? He was quite picky. He was quite concerned about his reputation as a remote viewer. And he goes, Jupiter? He goes, no, because we can't confirm whether I'm right or wrong. So I want you to pick a place where we can absolutely 100% confirm whether I'm right or wrong. And when they said, well, actually, you'll find that in 1973, NASA sent Pioneer 1 in 1973, which is a space probe, if you believe in space. You that, didn't it? And in 1974, Pioneer 2 went, and it passed by Jupiter. So they said, why don't we remote view Jupiter? And so he describes these things in Jupiter. He describes the atmosphere, he describes the mountains on Jupiter, and then he describes something that the scientists had never known about, that they outright thought he's wrong, 100%. He described rings around Jupiter, just like the rings that we have around Saturn. And until then, it was not known that there were rings around Jupiter. And he said these rings are very close to the surface, made up of fine dust, ice, and small asteroids. And they said, okay, well, let's see. When Pioneer 1 did its flyby, it confirmed everything else he said, but they didn't find the rings. Until 1979, NASA, again with their big budget, sent out another couple of space probes, Voyager. So in 1979, Voyager confirmed the existence of these rings around Jupiter, which I'm sure many people in this room outside here probably didn't know. We always associate the rings with Saturn and Neptune, Uranus a little bit, not Uranus, a little bit, but even Jupiter was discovered to have rings around it. They discovered that in 1979, and the Horizon in 2007 was successful in actually taking a photo of these rings. So this was a big lift for Ingo Swann. And so obviously you can see the CIA, not just the CIA, but a new thing opened. Stargate project. You probably heard of Stargate, yeah? Many people probably heard of Stargate project, or you see the movie Stargate, the series, right? All about wormholes and time stuff. Okay, so this project started. This was a secret U.S. Army unit that was established in 1977 at Fort Meade in Maryland. Right? So they had a small group of 15 to 20 remote viewers, which means they would grab the best of their psychics and they would train them in certain protocols. So they used the protocol to ensure that people were using the same method and it became more reliable. And it was very interesting because this method of using northern latitude, southern latitude, longitude numbers was easy for the remote viewers, easier for the remote viewers to use. But in the early days, they didn't have access to this in the early 70s. But by 1977, by the 80s, it was quite established, and they call that the SCAN8 protocol. Okay, again, it's the protocol that was developed by Ingo Swann and the Stanford Research Institute. So we have the Stargate project based in Maryland. That this was basically done by the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and also SRI International, which was the Californian contractor. So they were sending remote viewers there. The remote viewers were also working from California. So it's very interesting going back to Ingo Swann and Pat Price both finding this NSA listening station that was over 3,000 miles away from where they were sitting. They're sitting in a room in California, 3,000 miles away, they described the same compound, and that pissed off all the other intelligence agencies, but also the military branches of military. It pissed them off, but then they all started their own. So now we know that the Navy had this, the Army had their own, we had the Air Force has them, all branches of the military and all intelligence agencies had their own remote viewing departments. So when you see, like, oh, wait a minute, I read on Wikipedia that they shut it down in 1993 or 1995. This project went from 1997 to 1993, and they shut it down. The reason? This is according to the CIA. Why is the CIA involved in the Army? Oh, okay. Anyway, according to the CIA, because it wasn't given enough accurate information. So they gave him a project, they gave him a budget of like $1 million. It was, they gave more money to other crazy little projects. They gave way more money. And yet, in 2014, what we call the ONR, which is the Office of Naval Research, 2014, they actually budgeted, earmarked $4 million for a 4-year project where they were trying to train Marines and sailors on premonition and ESP. So when they say they shut these programs down, I think we all know that they did it for the reasons of public, to keep the public happy. They say it's shut down, nothing to see here. But I think that they've poured hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into these projects. Now the interesting stuff is Ingo Swann in 1975, in March 1975, Ingo Swann was taken. He was actually contacted by these people to this day. Well, he died in 2013, but he was contacted by a group that didn't seem military, and he referred to this guy, Mr. Axelrod. Anyway, he was taken away to these remote places, and he was paid $1,000 a day, and they gave him a specific task of remote viewing the far side of the moon. Exciting! What? Yeah, back in 1975. 1975, it's a long time ago, man. 50 years ago. They asked him, and he was like, what? And they gave coordinates. So in the same way as I explained 2 weeks ago, the moon also has a north pole and a south pole. They gave coordinates to him. And these coordinates were on the far side of the moon. But again, it's a blind thing. All he has is an envelope, and he doesn't know what he's looking at. He doesn't even know. He thinks it's on Earth. So he has no idea. So he's going in blind, and he's looking, he's describing like these pyramids, he's describing tracks, which look like, they look like tracks on the lunar soil. Everything is dark. He's going so dark here because he's on the far side of the moon, not on the light side of the moon. He described seeing like a dome. He sees a dome inside a crater. And the story goes that he sees this green haze. And he sees this green haze, and he takes his consciousness closer in. As he goes closer into this building, he sees that the haze is actually a green hue. It's a light that's emitted from the windows. So he goes closer and closer. And the story is, he wrote this in his book. He published in 1998 called Penetration. Thank you very much for giving me the book. But he wrote this in his book. As he took his consciousness right up to the window, when he looked in, he saw beings inside working. And he saw apparently up to a dozen entities inside there working. And he's explaining this. As he's remote viewing, he's talking aloud. And he's got an analyst on the other side who's just listening. And he's talking aloud. I'm seeing these beings. I can see these people, but they're not human. They're doing something. And he goes, oh, wait a minute. One's looking at me. And then 2, and then 5. They're all looking at me. They're pointing at me now. And he was told immediately, get away from that place. Take your consciousness away and get out of there. So he leaves. And then, when he's debriefed and he's talking to the analyst, he's going, we were on the moon. And he didn't know at the beginning, the analyst saying. And he goes, they weren't human. And they're mining. And he came up with the idea that they're mining, that they're actually mining the moon. So, in short, Ingo Swann is of the belief that there is an ancient extraterrestrial civilization that is living within the hollow moon, partially hollow moon, that is mining the surface. They're mining the surface of the Earth, of the moon, and sometimes, periodically, they come back to Earth, they take water, and they use it for the mining operations on the moon, is what he came out with in 1975. Sounds a bit crazy? It gets crazier. Wait a minute, we're just getting warmed up. We're just getting warmed up. I told you we're going to link remote viewing to the moon and to Mars as well. Okay, so we have Pat Price. So let's just jump from Pat Price to Joe McMoneagle. Joe McMoneagle, I believe, is 88. Now he's still alive. He's still alive. He's one guy that I'm writing to try and get him to actually talk about his experience. Because, first of all, let me go back to Pat Price. One of the main things that Pat Price did is when Pat Price was asked to view these coordinates, he went into the Soviet Union, and he went into Russia in the early 1970s. He was asked to go to specific coordinates and describe what he saw. He went in there and he ended up drawing pictures, because they're often using a pencil and paper, and he drew this massive gantry, which is like a massive crane, like ginormous. He said, this crane is the biggest I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen anything this big. And he drew it. And then as he was viewing this location, he said that somebody walked past one of the wheels. And he said the wheels were probably at least 10 feet high, because a human walked past and they're half the size of the wheel. But the wheels were also on tracks. And he drew this massive thing. So just so happened that a few years later, the NSA and the CIA obtained photos of this location, and based on the photos, when they compared the photos of what they had, and they had a CIA analyst draw a sketch and compare it to the drawing of Pat Price, remarkable accuracy. So he was basically explaining this. Another one where he was given another target. He was going into the Soviet Union again. A lot of trips to Russia without going there. So he was going to the Soviet Union. And as he was in here, this is where it gets really interesting. As he's in here, given these specific coordinates to go to, something keeps tugging at his mind and pulling him to a different place. But he's trying to focus on the target. But something just keeps pulling him away. And it's pulling him away to a place that he later describes as Alaska. And he sees this mountain, and he can't focus. His mind is pulled to this mountain in Alaska called Mount Hayes. And in it, he starts seeing something. Then the analyst brings him back in the session. Now, this intrigued him. So what happened is Pat Price went home on his own. He remote viewed, and he went straight into this location in Alaska, a place called Mount Hayes. So Mount Hayes is in the middle of this area known as the Alaskan Triangle. So Alaska is known to have a lot of geomagnetic anomalies. So it has negative geomagnetic anomalies where it seems that the magnetic field is all screwed up. And the center of that screw up of crazy magnetic activity, phenomena, is right in the center where Mount Hayes is. So he goes in and he remote views Mount Hayes. He goes in there and he describes within the mountain, he describes a dome with control centers beneath it, inside the mountain. So he's seeing these control centers. Then he starts seeing beings that are actually doing the controlling. And he said these beings look like humans, but they're not quite human. He goes in and he goes, they're not human. And he sees all this machinery that he can't explain, because we're talking about the early 1970s. He can't explain what he's seen. He's trying to. And so as he goes in, he goes to another level inside the same base, let's call it a base, within the mountain of Mount Hayes. He goes to another level and he comes across US soldiers. And he said these are US military personnel that are working side by side or above each other in the same complex that are actually working side by side. So he's trying to work out what this is. Long story short, he comes to the conclusion that Mount Hayes, and the reason why there's this crazy electromagnetic interference and activity, is he believed that it was some kind of portal that they were creating, which is maybe what we call a jump gate or a Stargate, right? Interesting. Anyway,
he remote viewed a little bit further. So Mount Hayes was one. He went to another target and he discovered, long story short, he discovered 4 mountains on the planet Earth, 4 mountains that were exactly the same, that had 4 ET/human bases in them. And one is in Australia, called Mount Zeal, which is in Australia. Another one is called Mount Perdido, which is in Spain. And another one called Mount Inyangan, which is in Zimbabwe. These are the 4 locations that he actually came up with in the early 1970s and described them with great detail. So I told you before, Pat Price, he got killed, or he died, we're not sure. He died in 1975. What happened is the Stargate program continued. It was under the leadership of a guy called, well, it's a long name, Frederick Holmes Skip Atwater. If you've ever seen the movie, 2009 movie, I believe, 2009, which is The Men Who Stare at Goats. If you've seen that movie, George Clooney, Jeff Bridges, Ewan McGregor, it's a hilarious movie, but it's quite recent. That movie is basically, George Clooney refers to himself as a Jedi Knight, psychic Jedi Knight, right? And he talks about a guy called Skip. They mention it. If you don't know anything about remote viewing, it'll just whatever, Skip, whatever. But actually, when I saw the movie, it's like, oh my God, he's talking about Project Stargate. He's talking about remote viewing. Skip Atwater was a well-known figure in those circles, not these circles, now in these circles, in those circles of remote viewing. And Skip is still alive today. And he's given many interviews, he's done talks, like in 2009, he confirmed all of the information that was put out about remote viewing. He's confirmed it in 2009, he did great talks, public speaker. And it's very interesting because some of these guys are still alive. Now, enter the 80s. In the early 80s, we have another guy, Joe McMoneagle, who wrote a book called The Stargate Chronicles, I think, and it's called My Life as a Psychic Spy, right? So Joe McMoneagle was very successful as a remote viewer. He also did hundreds of thousands of sessions, and he's known, he was very active from about 1978 until 1984. He was very active. And he was sent by the new director of Stargate Project. Joe McMoneagle was sent in, was given the coordinates of the 4 secret ET/human bases that 10 years before that Pat Price had remote viewed. And Joe McMoneagle went in and he saw more detail, but he confirmed the existence of these 4 sites. And again, he's not told, oh, by the way, you're going to stand on the shoulders of your predecessor. Your predecessor, he went in and he went to Australia, Spain, he went to Zimbabwe and Alaska, and he saw these. Tell me what else you can see. No, none of that. It was called what we call a double-blind experiment. Double-blind meaning the analyst that gave him the envelope like this, sitting there, the analyst and the remote viewer, which is Joe McMoneagle, neither of them know what is inside the envelope. So what happens is sometimes if the analyst has a very strong feeling and he knows the content, sometimes the remote viewer can pick up on this analyst's thoughts and feelings. But no, it was a double-blind test. So interestingly, Joe McMoneagle confirmed all of these 4 bases and some. He actually said there are more. Seabed bases also exist. And then I've heard the recordings of even more remote viewers after Joe McMoneagle. They had other remote viewers come in. There's a guy called Ed Dane. Ed Dane, in the mid-80s to the early 90s, he also was an analyst that would give the information to the viewers, remote viewers. He also trains people in remote viewing. In fact, in the 90s, I bought one of Major Ed Dane's remote viewing courses back then. I was young, 20 years ago. But it's amazing. These people are real and they're doing this stuff. So this has been remote viewed by numerous remote viewers and with great detail. And interestingly, the early ones in the 70s couldn't explain what they were seeing. It's just like you take someone who's from the Amazonian jungle, just take an indigenous person who lives in the jungle, put them inside an airplane cockpit and say, describe what you see. they have no words for it. They can't describe. So they use things that are familiar to their everyday life to explain phenomena or objects that they can't otherwise explain. But it's super fascinating about these bases that have been here for a long time. Okay, next thing. Joe McMoneagle, 1984, so 1982. 1982, Joe McMoneagle is given coordinates. He's asked to describe, again, he's given coordinates and he's asked to describe what he sees. So he goes into this, not trance, but he goes in, he focuses in on these coordinates and he comes back and he reports, I see tall structures. They're pyramids, they look like pyramids. Yeah, they're definitely pyramids. And then the analyst says, go inside, what do you see inside the structures? And he goes, I see tall, shadowy figures. They're very tall, shadowy, but they seem like they're of a time before, that they're there but they're not there. But they're tall and they're thin and they look tired and they look like they're waiting for something. The analyst says, go back in time when they are there. So Joe McMoneagle goes back and he goes, okay, I've got a time. Now I see more. And he reports seeing a monument that resembled the Washington Monument, a tall obelisk-shaped object sitting there. He reports craters with roads and canals. He reports structures like pyramids and other shelters that he believes were used as storm shelters by this people. And he goes, do you see the natives, the inhabitants? And he says, yes, they're there. They are there. I see them. Tall, big, large, thin bodies, entities. Definitely they're there. And I say, okay, session is over. So he comes out. And when they open the envelope, so the coordinates, these are the coordinates actually. When they open the coordinates and they look at them, it says target Mars. Time of interest approximately 1 million years ago. So what they're saying is Joe McMoneagle went back 1 million years in the past to see when these beings that he saw at one point in time, to see when they were alive and thriving. It was 1 million years BC, and it wasn't on Earth, and he had no idea. He thought it was on planet Earth, but it was on Mars. So this is one remote viewing that he's done. Okay, so there are many instances and many interesting stories about remote viewing. I mean, Ingo Swann, fascinating guy. He was an artist. He was a very interesting guy, and he tells the stories in a very flamboyant way. And his book, Penetration, that came out in 1998, is very interesting. He refers to other books, and this is interesting. Ingo Swann, in his book, talks about, just like we have these little drinky poos, we get together in front of the bar, in the bunker, and we talk about like aliens and stuff like this, and we talk about energy and spiritual entities, spirituality. In his book, he talks about how he used to get together with people. PhD, parapsychology, PhD holder, one woman, Viola Mead, another woman, Karagula, Dr. Karagula. These were people doing psychical research, right? And then there were other people that he had a dinner party with. And after a few bottles of wine, their lips got a little looser and they started talking about crazy phenomena. They started talking, and these are PhDs, these are scientists. And they started talking about stuff like, they walk among us. And he's like, yep, because he personally had a couple of experiences. Ingo Swann, I'm talking about, have a couple of experiences where he was 100% with every fiber of his being. He was convinced that the woman, and he explained it, that she was very, very sexy, very hot, attractive, magnetic, almost. So he felt he wanted to be next to her. But as soon as he came next to her, he felt like, oh, danger, danger. The hairs on his body stood up, and he said, I feel she's an ET, she's not human. Now, interestingly, I told you before that he was rushed away, and he was told to do the moon, far side of the moon reading, right? That reading was not at Stanford Research Institute, just to be clear. So you imagine he's a volunteer, he goes to work, he goes to SRI, he does his readings, and then when he's off for a week, he gets a phone call. People pick him up, they put a bag over his head, they take him, they said, are you okay in a helicopter? Are you comfortable in a helicopter? He nods, they put him in a helicopter and they take him somewhere. They take him all the way to a structure. He feels that he's going downstairs, going underground in a lift, spin him around, put him in a room, sit him down, then they take the hood off, and then he meets the guy who's in charge. Then he was asked to remote view the far side of the moon, but he didn't know it was the far side of the moon. After the first session, he started talking in detail with the guy he was with. And I mean, they were in an installation that had swimming pool quarters for him to be. They had his favorite cigars. They knew everything about him. They knew everything about him. He, up until he died, has no idea what agency they work for. He has no idea. But the way that the main guy, who called himself Axelrod, the way that he talked suggested that there was definitely an urgency, and it was more like a confirmation. They needed psychics like Ingo Swann to confirm what they believed was true, because of flybys, if you don't believe it, by Apollo 12, flybys by NASA and other probes around the moon that had taken all of these photos of structures, of even possibly crashed craft that they believe were there for millions of years. So even though Ingo Swann gave him a little bit of information, it seemed that he felt, and he wrote this in his book, that they had so much information already that they weren't sharing with him, and he wasn't basically allowed to ask questions. They wouldn't confirm or deny anything. But there were times where he said, oh my God, they know they're already there. And it's an ET civilization, and his impression was they're not friendly. The ones that are up there are not friendly. Okay? Now, it could be just that the specific coordinates that he was given and the place that he went to was just one base, because it seems that he went to a number of different coordinates on the moon and different places. So that's why it's very interesting how we can connect the remote viewing and the moon and Mars and Jupiter, and we can see that the idea, it's sort of people who are into metaphysics, who are into consciousness. It's sort of, in a way, if we believe the information, if you believe the information that I'm presenting, it suggests that consciousness can pretty well basically freaking go anywhere. It can go anywhere. And that was part of the ESP research, that these two guys, Hal and Russ, sorry, friends now, Hal and Russ is what they started back in 1972. And they just started something that cascaded into a massive operation that was adopted by all intelligence branches, by every branch of the military, and that they say they shut it down now. But as I said again before, the ONR actually just 7 years ago paid a bit more money, gave a budget to do more research on premonition to sailors. So you can see it's a very fascinating subject, and those who are into metaphysics, there's an overlap completely. And what I found interesting, looking into detail at these guys and other remote viewers, what was fascinating for me is it all came back. Often the ones that stood out were the ones where often they're asked to remote view ancient civilizations and other entities. It's apart from, like what they call active intelligence, right? Intelligence, actionable intelligence that you can act on as a military power or as a military. The amount of stuff, the mixture of Soviet Union bases, that kind of stuff, and the amount of stuff that was actually about extraterrestrial life, extraterrestrial technology, locations of their bases, what's on the far side of the moon. It was like, there's a lot of focus on the ET agenda, and I was actually quite surprised. Even though I love that stuff, I was still quite surprised how much ET agenda stuff was in the writings of Ingo Swann and even Joe McMoneagle. And I have his big book right in my bag here, and I have his book on his only book called Penetration, published in 1998 by Ingo Swann in that book. And there is an interesting thing. This book was published in 1998. So when he wrote it, he wrote so many chapters, right? Now what was happened, there was a guy called Dr. Sherman. This is a little detail. Sherman had information that Ingo Swann had written, and he found that information 20 years after Ingo Swann published the book in 1998. I believe it was only in the last 4 or 5 years maybe, that the information came to light, where Ingo made the decision back in 1999 not to put this remote viewing session of Mars in there. So until then, unless you read the book, a lot of people are not aware, but it appears that even, that's why the question mark, Ingo Swann has done remote viewing sessions on Mars. And that information is included in the updated edition of Penetration by Ingo Swann, which I believe only came out 4 or 5 years ago. So it's very fascinating, again, the connection between consciousness, and he claims it's the ability that every human, if trained, eventually in the future, maybe we will all have this ability, but maybe it's just something we need to train, the ability to remote view. You can see the upside, that would be cool, but you can see the downside. So I can just sit here and say, you know, I think Dennis is such a dork, and have that thought 1 second, that, oh, shit, sorry man, and we don't even have to speak. He can go, what the hell? Can you imagine? Think of how it will change humanity. Think of how it will change it. No longer are your thoughts shielded. You know, we can stop now, we have words, we can just stop talking, and I can think what I think, but you don't know. If we all had telepathy, all those dirty thoughts you have, all those bad thoughts about people, I mean, no longer.
There's actually a Canadian science fiction writer who wrote at least one book, if not two, on exactly that, and how it changed the world.
Yeah.
I read it about 15 years ago, but it's exactly what you're talking about.
And it's a very interesting hypothesis. And I think that they were well aware of it, SRI and the military, well aware of that back then. They were basically, when the NSA and all the intelligence agencies came in, because these two, Ingo and Pat got together and they busted the NSA's top secret listening station. That was the problem. They said, what the hell? Oh, well, wait a minute. It's bad that you found ours, but maybe then we can use it to find theirs. And that was the thinking. But they also realized that there's a danger, and this is where it gets dodgy. You have your own psychic spies. If they go rogue, you don't want these people, you know, it's like the born identity. You don't want these people loose, you know, if they're not playing on your team anymore.
And as I think that book was based on Jodie Foster, Contact.
Yeah, Contact, yeah. Great movie. Yeah. Good. Andy, how you doing? Okay, so guys, I'm going to finish it there, and let's just go straight any Q&A. Any questions? Andy, how you doing, buddy?
All right.
Good. Okay, here's a man that has actually met, you met Harold Puthoff, right?
Harold Puthoff, and I've done remote viewing with Russell Targ.
And he did remote viewing with Russell Targ. In California, in the US?
No, I did in the UK.
In the UK?
Yeah.
Fantastic, great. Okay guys, just any questions?
Sorry, Andy.
Yeah.
Have somebody go live.
Yeah, Lisa. Yeah.
Is it also called Project Looking Glass?
No.
That's
No.
something else.
Project
Right.
Looking Glass is different.
Okay.
Project Looking Glass, Yellow Book, different. This, I mean, eventually it was all put together and rechristened as like Stargate Project in 1991. They put it together again, but it went by names. It had lots of names like Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sun Street Project. You know, had lots of different names until they finally put it together and they just called it Stargate Project.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
Have any of these remote viewers gone into the future to see what will happen for humanity?
Well, there is a remote viewer that in the 80s, I believe, that remote viewed the Twin Towers, but it was ignored, or he was ignored deliberately. Yeah.
There's a lot of the remote viewing is almost time independent. So what they view, usually if they're doing a view today, they'll see what they see today.
Yeah.
But it's not a time dependent thing. So you can sometimes see what's going to be there or
Yeah.
has been there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they'll tell you the person who's actually published loads of work on this, like a lot more physical, technical work, is Edgar Mitchell,
Yeah, Edgar
Peter
Mitchell,
Marser, and Peter Rowlands.
Yeah.
Peter Rowlands is a physicist, and Peter Marser is a kind of computer scientist, and then they've done a whole load of crazy tests with. Are you aware of? It's not Rife. It's another guy. No, it's this guy invented this machine basically in the 50s, and his wife was psychic, and they would take these photographs.
Oh, Curlian photography.
Not Curlian photography. No, they were doing what they were doing. They would, so for example, they had a cow. They don't know what's wrong with the cow, so she would have a blood sample of the cow, and they took a photograph of the cow, and then they would then see that there was a a wire in the cow's stomach. The cow had eaten a wire and the cow was sick. And when they got hold of all of these photographs that had been produced and they put them into MRI technology, they came out as perfect MRI 3D images. And people who saw them and Edgar Mitchell, who's friend, bought all this stuff, were going, this is the best NMRI scan stuff 3Ds we've ever seen, and this is 1930s photographic
Right.
dates.
Interesting.
So it's all to do with the icon.
Yeah.
You have to have an icon to tune in to the universe's information system. And when you do that, and it's time independent.
That's what we were just talking about before. You know, like they use coordinates. If you look at, you'll see like sometimes like two sets of numbers is very common. Two sets of numbers, and then people just go like, do a scribble. They do a little scribble. That's sort of like the anchor for them. That's as I said before, throwing the hook to get some starting place to start going into the viewing session.
Talk about the work they did on trading the silver market. You know, they did basically what they did was they test it out and they trade the silver market. So they try and predict what happened to the silver market in the future. And it's quite a boring thing, remote viewing. So what they would do is they would have a flag, and they would hoist the flagpole up the pole if the market went up, and they would have the flagpole down if the market was down the next day. So what they were viewing was whether the flag was up or down the next day.
Right.
So Targ and Kutov did that, and they made about $200,000 on trading silver. And people say, well, why don't you continue? I mean, the guy who started it all off is, and she did talk about Andrija Paul Harridge as well.
No. It's a basic introduction.
Okay,
So it's a basic introduction. So let me just grab a couple questions, basic questions, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. Mark.
I just wanted to say, with all the structures on the moon that you were speaking about that they found, has that been validated by any kind of modern trips up there?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's if you believe we've been to the moon or not. Okay, you're talking about probes and stuff, right? Yeah. Even the Chinese rover took a photo. It's there. They call it the mystery hut. I mean, what Ingo Swann was describing was like, you know. No, so you have to look for it. Just like a lot of this stuff you have to look for. You'll read the basic stuff, right? But again, I've got it down here. Uri Geller is like, often these are the main people that come up, and then you might find Uri Geller, but he was taken out of the program. There were concerns that his methods were a little bit trickster, you know, some people thought he was a bit of a fraud, so he was removed. This is where you'll see most of the information, okay? In the same way about the structures and about what you're talking about specifically, there are probes. There are probes that have actually taken probes, and there are like probes from the 50s and the 60s taking photos of structures. But also, like recently with the Chinese probe, they call it the mystery hut. That's the translation from Chinese, and it's there, right? And this is what people are talking about. You can see the structures, you know, and a lot of them have been out there. There's a book written by, was it George Leonard? In 1976, he wrote a book called Someone Else is on the Moon, What NASA Won't Divulge. Okay, now he took 35 photos from NASA. This is 1976, so we're talking not long after the moon landed, you know, 5-6 years. So he's even got the official like NASA number, photography, the number of the photo. So it's very, very thorough. His research was quite thorough. And he talks about, you know,
Look it up on Google, can you? Probably not.
you can try DuckDuckGo, try, you know, research.com, but I'm not sure, but you can find the stuff. And this, again, a lot of my stuff I get out of books I like because they'll give you sources to go to specifically find. Like, I mean, some of this stuff, I don't know how many hours I spent going through like CIA, you know, FOIA, like CIA releases. You think remote viewing, okay, it sounds great story, Pat, but it's not much. I mean, they do dumps. You can see stuff from the 70s, and I look at the document from the 70s, and then approved for release 2001, approved for release 2003. They did a dump of 15 million pages on remote viewing. So even if you don't believe it, they do. That's the point. Even you think, it's bullshit. Well, okay, you think it's bullshit, but the government, the intelligence agencies obviously don't. 15 million pages, and that was just one dump on remote viewing. So yeah, it's a lot. About the structures, a lot. And even back in the 70s, probably or possibly more from back then than now. I mean, more easily to find, you know, old books from back then. Yeah.
Yeah, I can believe there's an awful lot of information out there that most people don't think about.
Yeah. I mean, you hear the stories and stuff. It's just a matter of how far you want to go in researching on this stuff. And that's it. Is it that important to you? I'm just presenting it here because I'm sure that you probably, oh, that was a great talk, but I don't want to go into that much detail, right? So this is just an intro, and if you are interested, now you can go into that detail. You can look at some of the books, you know, and some of the references that are in the books, you know. And like a lot of the stuff, there were people at the beginning saying, Ingo Swann, was he really working for, you know, did he really work for SRI? Did he really go into the CIA? Nah, who knows? But the name appears about, I can't remember how many papers, CIA, and it's not easy to read the CIA documents when they drop them. They're written in a form that is so difficult to read, like lines squashed together, but his name appears so many times, hundreds of times in the documents, as does Pat Price. Is probably the guy we know least about. But it seems that he was super talented, is the consensus by some of the guys. The guy who ran the program from the Stargate project from 1977 to 87, right? It changed from Skip Atwater, or Frederick Holmes Skip Atwater. In 87, the project head became a guy called Ed May. Ed May's still alive. Skip is still alive. Skip, first name basis here. They're still alive, and they all confirm, as do the CIA documents that have been dumped, they all confirm that these guys were working on these projects. Yeah. Any other? Yes.
Why?
That's okay.
Why all the hidden structures on the moon, on the dark side?
Yeah. Okay. Isn't that interesting? It's like the remote viewing part. You remember what I said to you? We're doing remote viewing, and yes, we'll connect it to the moon. Everyone's interested in on the dark side, the far side of the moon. The far side of the moon. Exactly. Yeah. Because it's the far side of the moon. Yeah, is one main reason, because we can't see it, because we never see the far side of the moon from Earth, right?
Why should they construct these structures on this side and not on our side?
Exactly. That's
So
because we
that
can't see it.
because we can't see
To
it,
hide it.
that's it. And again, I know. Look, here we go. It's like, it's not as if I really love talking about the moon, but I do. And the moon, the thing is, the moon is a fascinating topic, and like, it's like, you know, the mainstream will tell us that Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Back in the 70s, there were people that believed it was 3.5 billion years old, but now we're told it's 4.5 billion years old. If you believe we did go to the moon rocks that they brought back, the 900 pounds of moon rocks that they brought back, shows that the moon rocks were actually 5.5 billion years old. And the dust upon which those rocks were sitting was another billion years older. And as I said last time, the craters, the diameter of the craters, small crater, big crater, medium crater, doesn't really matter. The depth of the crater, despite a massive diameter, seems to be all quite similar. And that is one reason, that's what got geologists going, well, that's not possible. On Earth, that cannot happen. If you have a big crater that big, you can determine the depth of the crater. You'll see the crater will be deeper, but not on the moon. It seems that it's a standard, roughly, depth that doesn't make sense when you look at the diameter of the crater mouth. Interesting. The other thing, that's where, as I said last time, there were certain scientists and astrophysicists that believe that the moon possibly had an outer shell. The moon is 1 billion to 2 billion years old. So here it comes down to this. It comes down to this, if we're to summarize. Considering, because the age, the density of the moon, who was I telling before? The density of the moon is like 3.35 grams. 3.35 grams per cubic centimeter. Versus the density of Earth is like 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter, right? It's different. It just seems apparent that the moon and the Earth were not made at the same time or in the same place. And this is what baffles scientists, and this is why the moon is often referred to as an anomaly.
I want to ask, is it worthwhile doing any astronomy in Samui, or is it too much light?
Oh, I couldn't tell you. I honestly couldn't tell you. I mean, I wanted to. I had a crazy idea. I did design a tower to put in the back, right where the bunker is, back in 2016. I was going to build a 12-meter tower, that's the maximum, and put an observatory. I actually wrote to a company in the US, gave them dimensions for me to have one of those like telescopes, you know, to put a telescope on top of a 12-meter structure.
Maybe it'd be good to do it in the centre of the island.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, but definitely, if you want to see the moon, to see is the moon really curved, and if you have doubts and I think it's a disk, just grab, not even a telescope, grab a set of binoculars and look up at the moon, and you will see it clearly enough to know, oh, maybe that isn't a disk, because isn't just a disk, a flat disk. You'll think, oh, okay, but because this is it's something that we as a group, we also have to be very careful. We do not fall into believing theories that are based on nothing. You know what I mean? We go out, we outright reject the mainstream narrative, and as a result we get that backlash. We go all the way, the pendulum swings from I believe mainstream, no I don't, I reject it, and we go and we readily adopt a different narrative, and sometimes without adhering to rigid critical thinking, without applying the right questions. We just adopt it. It sounds better, it's not that one, I take it because it's the opposite. And we tend to do that sometimes even with things like the moon, the stars and stuff, which is why I think it's important to study mainstream, learn the mainstream science that we've been taught, learn that first, then now you go, oh, I got it. So this is how the moon, the earth, the sun and the planets, got it. Then you can say, but no, I don't agree, I think it's bullshit. And that's totally up to you, but at least understand it first before you reject it. At least understand it before. Otherwise, you're given an incomplete picture. You know what I mean? You say, like I was surprised how many people didn't even understand why we don't see the far side of the moon. The explanation. I gave it to you 2 weeks ago. I'll admit, I only actually learned it myself 3 weeks ago. But anyway, I gave it to you 2 weeks ago. I was a week ahead. You know what I mean? I'm saying, it's something that we take for granted. We don't actually learn it. And we just think, oh, the moon goes around. But we don't think about, why do we only see one side? Or we do, but then we stop there. Or we can't explain it ourselves, so we stop there. Once you understand how it actually works, then it's easy to go, oh, okay, so I used to think this, and this, but now, if this mainstream science is credible, and I do accept it, then it makes sense why this anomaly happens or doesn't happen. So I just bring it all back to you. In short, there are so many anomalies about the moon that there are probably more scientists that think, why the hell is the moon there, rather than blah, blah, blah. You'll probably, I'm guessing, guesstimate, find just as many scientists, if not more, that think it shouldn't be like it is. There's so many anomalies about our moon, you know, for example. So anyway, to answer your question, yeah, just get a pair of binoculars, take a look at the moon, and you'll see a lot, yeah.
But I think it's really important as well that that's what we're doing here from a critical thinker's point of view, is we're gathering as much information as possible to be able to make a more informed decision.
That's it.
Regardless of how outrageous it is.
Yep, and it could be anything. It could be the moon, it could be health, it could be anything, right? And again, I'm not saying that I'm right, I'm just presenting the information. It's good that we all look into it and it's like, okay, but it's really important we ask questions, you know, and ask, I don't want to say the right questions, but I'll say the right questions, or good questions, I should say. Because what is right and wrong, right? Yeah.
And one of the things you've got to realise about mainstream science is that the more we learn and the more we increase our knowledge of the universe, the more information we get. So mainstream science's information basically comes from a level of knowledge that then a paradigm's created. So you can get books from Harvard professors 100 years ago talking about how much coal would have to be burning on the sun to produce that amount of heat, etc., 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 because what they understood
at the time.
today. Now it's nuclear fusion. Fusion. You've got people like Pierre Robitaille, who basically shown that the sun basically is liquid metal, hydrogen. So he's castigated as being, well, what do you know? Well, Pierre Robitaille was the top guy on MRI scanning, and all of that knowledge comes from the fact that a load of scientific theory and assumptions that they've used to predict what the sun's made of are completely disproven by NMRI scanning. I can't remember the name of the Kirchhoff's law, for example. So Kirchhoff is about black body radiation, and Kirchhoff's law basically said that any energy put in something will be immediately reflected, but only if it's or absorbed. It's only absorbed if it's a black body. If it's a light body, it's reflected, and that's how NMRI scanners work. So the moon, so all the stuff they've got on the moon's wrong, but in 100 years' time, everyone will look back at today's theory and go, "How did they believe that?" I mean, they even had the information where they shouldn't have had that. So science goes through paradigms, and the only time the paradigms change is when people die. So that is another situation. It's not that anyone's necessarily trying to pull the wool over your eyes. It's that they pull the wool over their own eyes, and eventually all those people who believe something have got to die, and the next lot of knowledge has got to come out. So I wouldn't go, there's conspiracy theories, but then there's just kind of the humanity, the way humans work. You have a collective belief system, and they all, like little sheep, jump over the fence, and the black sheep that says it's wrong gets ignored until everyone suddenly realises the black sheep was right, and then all the black sheep are white sheep.
Exactly. It's that cycle. Good observation. Thank you. It's a good comment, and it's so true.
Science has paradigms, and there's a great saying in NLP: "Is the map is not the territory." And so we have they take their best knowledge to create a map, but the map and reality, it's like archaeology. The archaeologists, they find the pyramid. It must be a tomb. We haven't found any bodies in it, but it must be a tomb. It's a pretty amazing structure. No one can actually build it today. So
and they never found a body in it.
No, there's never been a body found in any pyramid. So all the bodies are buried in the Valley of the Kings. You can go to Egypt; they're all in the Valley of the Kings. No one buried anyone in pyramids. So that's archaeologists always tell a story. Physicists, when they talk about cosmology, they know a little bit of information. We're a tiny planet. We've got telescopes. We aren't out there. So they get information and they tell a story because they want a PhD, and to get their PhD, they do a study and they tell a story. And there's 1,000 stories, and if you've got any sense at all, you read half of them. Well, you read 99% of them. You realise it's just utter nonsense. But that's the way it works.
It's absolutely true.
And you only get a PhD, by the way, if you repeat what the mainstream is. You don't get a PhD. There's a whole bunch of people who've changed the world, and they never got their papers published.
Because they wouldn't. Thanks, Andy.
Sorry, what do you think happened to the spoons of Uri-Geller? How was they work?
I have no idea. No idea. Okay, so one is that he was doing real telekinesis, using his mind to bend the spoons. There are others that say that he was possibly using some kind of super glue acid to bend the spoons, weaken them. He was rubbing for a long time. There's a guy called Randy the Great, a magician, who goes around disproving. Randy the Great is a great magician. He's very, very good. And he's saying, there's nothing wrong with it, what he's doing. Just be honest about it. Just tell the truth. You're not bending it with your mind. You're using some sort of technique. And he claims, Randy the Great claims that he can do any trick that Uri Geller can do. Okay, that's what he claims, right?
It was not checked.
So the one reason why he sort of, not pushed out, but a little bit pushed out and wasn't used as much, is because there were a lot of scientists criticizing at the beginning when they were young, saying, look, the protocols they're using with Uri especially, because he's a very, he's a nice amiable guy, and then he'd get away with stuff which, it's not very scientific protocols being used here. So I don't know.
So
A shaman, yeah.
if you go back actually with Uri Geller and you take what Uri Geller says, so the real, all of this really started. All of this is connected with UFOs, yeah. And so, if you go back into the 50s, you see, the US government will always deny that there's no UFOs. They had the first UFO study they did was in 1947, and it came back as they're not ours, they're someone else's, yeah. Whether someone else is on this planet or someone else, but they weren't the Americans. So they then started this whole program where people were doing psychic channeling. So Project Stargate comes from that. The people who wrote the book Project Stargate, and then name escapes me now, they were really talking about all the psychic channeling stuff that went on. So there was the top guy in UFOs in Canada was a guy called Wilbert Smith, and the CIA, like all the top people in the CIA, were all doing this channeling with Arthur Bell. Weirdly, what's his name, who assassinated Kennedy, was part of that group. There's all UFO connections everywhere with all of this stuff.
Definitely.
Andrija Paul Harridge was the guy who was paid by the CIA to do loads of research on psychic stuff. And the first big psychic guy was a guy called Peter Hertat, who we literally.
Do you know what, Andy? Can you wait one sec? Shall we just stop the recording and then we can just talk about it? Otherwise we'll go forever. Do a wrap up. I mean, so let's just wrap it up. So I'm just going to stop it because we're recording. So just one thing, interesting. What I said before, how interesting it was that the focus that was put on the alien agenda, UFOs. There are many stories that Ingo Swann talks about UFOs. Him being taken to observe UFOs in places that he thought was like Alaska, but he wasn't sure, but he observed them, he witnessed them coming out, and he was like, oh, they're not friendly. There were drones, for example, right? Now, UFO phenomenon, just so you know, Harold, even Ingo Swann and Pat Price, just so you know, were also part of the Church of Scientology, Ron Hubbard, right? They were in Scientology. By the end of the 70s, all three of them had left the church. Even Hal had gone up to the highest level in the Church of Scientology. Just saying that there was a big influence there as well. Okay, I'm going to end the talk here. Thank you very much, and we can.
What do you have next?
Thank you very much, guys. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Okay, cheers. Great.